we start the symposium today. So welcome back everyone. Let's move on to the research talk session part 2. So same as our previous session, its presenter will give 20-minute talk followed by a 5-minute Q&A. And our first speaker in this session is Professor Tsuchiya from the School of Psychological Sciences, Monash University. Professor Tsuchiya and his team try to define consciousness, test whether it exists in other life forms, and explore whether it can be imparted to machines or robots. And he has been collaborating with Professor Ishikura and Professor Asaka for some time. And today he will present towards understanding the relationship between structures of consciousness and information. Professor Tsuchiya, please go ahead.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Can you hear me? Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So today I'm going to talk about this relationship between structure of consciousness and the information. And thank you for the invitation for this symposium. The link here pasted as a QR code is for our YouTube channel, where Hiroshi and I did a kind of a discussion on consciousness and robotics once a while ago, and it was quite popular. So, but it was in Japanese, so maybe this is only for Osaka University people. And this is a link for my recent book, also again in Japanese. But if you are from Osaka, and then maybe you can take a look if you are interested in after listening to my talk today. All right. So today's my talk is basically having two take-home messages. One is about sort of the introduction of my project called the Qualia Structure, and this is in fact a project funded by Japanese government, JSPS. And there, I'm pursuing this novel paradigm, which we call Qualia Structure, to quantify qualia or contents of consciousness, our feeling or perception, using a mathematical tool called category theory. And in particular, we are interested in using this theory called Yoneda lemma. And I'll explain what it means later. And then another second component is that through this collaborative project, I'm going to give a brief overview of what we are doing in this project using online psychophysics in adults and children, and the AEG and fMRI, as well as a recent computational alignment procedure to define or find the structure of a qualia and also information and it's their interaction or relationship. And then eventually, I want to briefly mention about the conceptual framework called relational monism, which may be interesting to people who are working on cognitive robotics or representational framework like Yanagisa-san, or maybe the presence or absence of the self like Nakano-san, who gave talk in the morning. So here's an introduction about the consciousness research. It may be safe to say that the modern sort of history of consciousness research has started with Descartes, who divided the world into the two kinds of substance, such as objective or subjective things. And basically, Descartes and Galileo and Kant has been claiming that what science should be focusing on is the objective side of the reality. And the subjective is too kind of difficult or not suited for scientific study. However, in 1990s and since then, the gap between the subjective and the objective has been narrowing. And my previous supervisor, Christoph Koch, for example, proposed a neural correlates of consciousness. And to the right, what we see is the fMRI study looking at putatively vegetative patients who were able to actually generate a similar kind of a brain response pattern in response to the inquiry from the experimenters. So this particular patient couldn't move, couldn't speak, and from the other people, he looked completely just dead, almost. But when he was asked about some kind of question and they imagine playing tennis or walking around, he could do that. And express that through the brain activation pattern. It's similar to Yanagisawa-san's finding, but this has been quite influential since this time of the discovery. And there has been many more follow-up study to kind of visualize and understand the consciousness using the neural imaging method. And all of these types of the development has blossomed over the last 30 years to a massive number of the proposal for the sort of the theory that links brain and consciousness. There are many things that has been proposed, and my own contribution has been rather empirical, but also recently conceptual kind of a contribution like category theory or null report paradigm that I'm going to briefly mention today. So, and my research group is embedded in the Melbourne-Monash consciousness research group called MMCR. If you type MMCR, then you can find it on the web. And that linking sort of the various type of the researchers going from arts to philosophy to robotics and neurology, and they are consisted of 30 or more than 30 faculty members, and involving more than 100 students. And we are recently, this activity resulted in a philanthropic kind of donation to establish this M3CS, Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies, like a study of consciousness and meditation, led by the philosopher Jakob Hofi. And I'm also part of the Biomedical Imaging Center, MBI, and also at the Turner Institute for the Brain and Mental Health. All right. So overall, to understand how the world works, I think it's really crucial to understand the relationship between consciousness and the brain. And that's also a part of the Hiroshi's talk. Like to understand the humanity, we need to go beyond just the perception or behavior. We need to go into the consciousness and social interaction. And the scientific research on consciousness is now being established. And the latest major upgrades includes some of the studies with a rigorous registration type experiment and also adversary collaboration promoted by Templeton Foundation over the last 4 years. So under this background, our particular interest and also contribution is this Qualia Structure project. And although I said that there are currently more than 10 theories out there for consciousness and the brain, most of them actually do not tackle with the central problem of defining or establishing gold standard of the consciousness study. What it means is that, for example, if I ask you, what do you see right now in front of, let's say, apple, red apple, then you can name the object like apple or red apple, but it doesn't really explain the way you are experiencing this thing. And in fact, in terms of experience, it's very difficult to define or explain what you are experiencing by words. And so, that led to, for example, Yanagisawa-san's talk, where the objective answer of the, all this decoding has been usually defined through the stimulus itself, not the experience itself, because we don't know the sort of the gold standard to compare with. So to cope with this kind of problem, what we have proposed is to use the relationship through different kind of experience. And for that, we propose to use this category theory. And currently, what we are doing is to establish this foundational work using mathematics and also psychophysics, but also we started doing the experiments on using the neuroimaging as well, and starting the computational approach as well. And we are focusing currently on the color qualia, because that's the most kind of intensely discussed topic in philosophy as well as psychology and neuroscience about the qualia. Whether do I experience the same kind of red as you or not? So traditional neuroscience has avoided the problem of consciousness altogether by just focusing on sensory input and how it translates to the brain activity, or brain activity translates to sensory input. But the consciousness experiment has used a slightly different kind of approach where the stimulus itself is the same, such as a Necker cube or Rubin's base or binocular rivalry, while brain activity actually fluctuates. And then at the same time, subjective experience also fluctuates. Necker cube can, face can look at, front or back, and that maybe there is an activity that corresponds to what you are experiencing at the time. So this mathematical theory of consciousness has been trying to find the relation between the brain activity itself and the conscious experience, dissociating from the stimulus. But this is actually a bit too narrow in the sense that any kind of experience is much richer than two kinds, and so we need to expand this kind of project. That's the rationale. So to understand the qualia or how we are experiencing, what we are paying attention to is this so-called structure of our experience or qualia. And this has been mentioned or implied by some prominent philosophers such as David Chalmers or Giulio Tononi. And in our hands, we have proposed to use mathematical tools called category theory, which is actually developed to study the structure of mathematical objects. And we are planning to apply it for qualia or consciousness. And in particular, the Yoneda lemma is the quite central thing of this endeavor. And what is the Yoneda lemma? Or how do we quantify qualia through this relationship? So the idea is to characterize something that is very, very difficult to define in itself through its relationship with others. So for example, if I ask you, what is your experience of the lead on the left side of this circle, then you can say that, oh, it looks like it's similar to the color of the wine or color of my shirt or something like that, but it's always in relation to others. And however, this kind of difficulty of trying to identify something has been actually faced by many different kind of fields. For example, in the case of the cognitive robotics, how can the robot actually attain the meaning of the words is very unclear. But by understanding the relationship between the words, then they can start to build the meaning. And it's probably the same way that human infants or babies also learn the words as well. Also, to identify the property of the animals or plants in the ecosystem, you need to understand not only animal in isolation, but how they are related to others in the ecosystem. Also, black holes are the cosmological object, but it's never possible to directly observe. But its relation with others allows us to analyze and also observe its property. Same goes with the infinity in math. In itself you can analyze, but its interaction with others can allow you to understand it. And the personality as well, like to understand or describe my personality, it's often easier to understand how I interact with other people, or what kind of friendship or what kind of organization I'm embedded in, like Monash and MBI and so on. So this is a highly intuitive kind of concept, but it's rigorously proven in category theory. And that's the Yoneda lemma. The Yoneda is the person, in fact, he was a Japanese person. And the lemma itself is a very difficult kind of shape here, and it doesn't really make sense to many of you. But the important thing is that as a consequence of this lemma, H of A, which means that the A's relationship with others is if they are the same as B's relationship with others, then automatically this rigorous mathematical proof actually allows you to say that A and B are equivalent. It's the same. And when you apply it in the case of the color qualia, if your red is similar to my relationship with the purple, and that with the orange and another red and so on, then you can actually potentially establish that we are experiencing the same kind of qualia, although it's not possible to directly compare that. So using this kind of approach, what we have been starting is the questioning some old question about color qualia. So some philosophers, as well as many of the psychologists and also cognitive scientists, believe that our color qualia in the periphery is illusory, and this is because some of the textbook says that our retinal cone declines so much at the periphery, so that all of the things that we are seeing in the periphery must be illusory. It's not there, but we are expecting, or we are memorizing this color, not really directly experiencing. However, if you look at this bottom left point with your fingernail at this adjusted size, then already by the time when you come around here without moving your eyes, your color cone should be degraded quite a lot. It's a 5-degree visual angle, but you still see and experience distinct color. And there is a huge discrepancy between the conventional thinking about color in the periphery and your actual experience. Why is that? So to address this question, what we have been doing is the online experiment, something like that. So here we are presenting two stimulus at the same time, and then briefly presenting it, so that you cannot move your eyes, and you cannot also expect the location and also the color of the stimulus as well. And then by asking people to report the similarity of this patches, we are trying to see whether the relationship of the colors are the same at the foveal color cone rich area and also peripheral areas, which many people believe that is not color sensitive. And led by Ariel Zeleznyko-Johnston, we did this kind of experiment, and it turned out that at least within the 10 15 degrees of the visual angle, roughly speaking, towards the end of edge of the display on your laptop, the color similarity relationship is the same between the central vision and the peripheral vision, as well as the central vision peripheral vision relationship is also the same. So most likely this is arising from the fact that the receptive field size at the peripheral neurons are increasing as to compensate for the lower density. But I'll talk about it later if you're interested about this result. And we are also conducting this type of experiment to extend it to the children and also potentially to babies. Many people believe that children do not have capacity to experience or express their experience itself with the words, but similarity relationship or odd one out relationship can be even reported by the kids as well. So here, this is just a starting point, but 10 to 12 years old or 7 to 9 years old, relationship of the color is pretty much the same as adults. And also a recent experiment of ours showed that the 5 to 6 years old is also quite similar to our color perception. And we think this is probably the first demonstration of this kind. And also we are conducting this type of experiment using fMRI and also neuroimaging in collaboration with Makiko Yamada and her postdoc Hirawa and so Miyamaya. We are doing this type of experiment while subjects are in the scanner. Previous experiments tend to rely on what the color similarity should be by based on norm of the subject's average responses. But we, according to our analysis, these kind of color structure, even though it looks quite clean at the level of the average subjects, each individual subject has a slightly different kind of patterns. So we thought that we need to do this by collecting the data from the same subject in terms of behavior and neuroimaging. And also, this kind of while we are doing this type of experiment, we also notice some of the difficulty in this representation similarity analysis. So one of the difficulty is that the similarity is not really symmetric, which was quite surprising to me when I noticed it, but it has been noted in the literature actually. So if I ask you, is China similar to North Korea? Then probably many people say, no, it's not similar. However, the same person, if you are asked, is North Korea similar to China? Maybe they say yes. And this is the kind of the conceptual asymmetry of the similarity, and there has been some kind of quantum model of the similarity proposed before. And something similar, in fact, happens for color qualia as well. If we present this, turquoise-looking or emerald-looking bluish green, similar to this, sky blue, then people tend to say, yeah, maybe with a rating of 4, 7 being the most different, and then 1 being the most similar. But if we reverse the order, then they tend to say, oh yeah, it's more similar. And it's very difficult to understand why this kind of similarity relation has to be direction dependent. But again, quantum cognition model, so-called, seems to fit really well in terms of our empirical result. And there is some kind of implication about that later as I talk about the relational monism. So, but anyway, what we are trying to do right now is that to identify the qualia structure in person A, and then look at how we can actually align or identify the similarity with that of the person B. So that's a sort of the qualia level similarity analysis, as well as a qualia to neural activity analysis, and also neural activity analysis. And we are planning to use that, some of the optimal transport technique that has been developed in the machine learning context. So the next steps of our project is to establish a qualia structure paradigm by focusing on the colors, but we are getting there for in a relatively short time, I hope. And my book is basically about sort of the planning of this kind of the project in a coherent manner, if you're interested. So to summarize, to sum up, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes for the implication of our research on the consciousness research and also beyond. So recently, I've been quite interested in this idea of the relational monism. And this is quite a different or quite a strong departure from the dualism introduced by Descartes in the beginning of the slides. So here, any kind of phenomena, both mental and physical, are hypothesized to co-arise or co-determine with the interaction of two entities. And then this arises from our particular viewpoint. And in terms of physics, this actually makes sense. For example, velocity is dependent on perspective of a viewer. Direction is as well, like up and down. If you look at through the level of the globe, up and down is basically the same direction. If you have a God's eye viewpoint, right? And it turns out that Carlo Rovelli, who is a famous philosopher, the physicist, he says that quantum theory can be actually most coherently explained according to relational interpretation of quantum theory by thinking that things that exist is actually only the relations and not the independent entity itself. And this led to quite an interesting parallel to the Buddhism, like Nagarjuna as emptiness, and also some of my colleagues' claims, Saigo and Taguchi, and also some philosophers in the Western people also said that it's what exists in the world is just one thing, monism. But then if you start to think about the relation as a fundamental thing, then it's obviously true that it's not really eternal. So maybe it leads to zeroism, closer to Buddhism. It's quite, new idea to me, but I think this is a potentially interesting kind of direction for those people interested in philosophical implication of consciousness research. But also, this has a particular implication for AI or robotics kind of research. Many of the robotics or AI research are sort of dependent on the initial, fundamental idea or intuition of the cognitivism or computationalism or representationalism. Like Yanagi-Sazan's, analysis is also like that. Basically, these are assuming what our brain is doing is to represent our outside world into our brain or consciousness in terms of symbols. And then what cognition does is the symbolic manipulation. And AI researchers are also basing on this type of intuition to develop AI. But from our relational monistic kind of point of view, it may lead to only sort of up to the point where you create a robot which doesn't have its own perspective. And that means that, no matter how we kind of, try to push the direction of the current, AI or cognitive robotics approach, it may be not enough. And quantum cognition, I mentioned, as a sort of asymmetry of the similarity rating, also has some kind of connotation to this kind of idea. If we assume that the similarity or representation is there in the beginning, then we shouldn't be able to get this kind of asymmetry of the directionality. However, if we think about our mind as something that generates the answer upon question, sometimes it's also considered as a phenomenological or non-representational ideas in philosophy. This kind of phenomena can be explained. And that's still like ongoing kind of thoughts, but just one idea to throw into this cloud. With that, I'll just stop. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsuchiya, for a very eye-opening presentation. So now the floor is open for questions. Yes, Asada-sensei.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. Very impressive talk. As you mentioned in the last slide or the most, this slide. So of course, I suppose I understand your view and also your approach. So for us, so how to design the artificial consciousness. So the relationship is one of the key points in the view, but how to apply or how can you suggest your view to design the artificial consciousness? So
yeah. So I think probably representational ideas of some of the early robotic kind of approach to represent the rules and represent the objects, represent the world is likely to be, not really suitable. But probably the kind of the cognitive robotics approach like you do is closer to potential, emergence of the perspective probably. But the perspective itself is not something that you shouldn't actually build into.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to suggest concretely, but the only thing that I can imagine successful, more likely to succeed is to mimic really the brain, because the brain is humongously complicated web of the relations. If we think about it, right? So if we can ever replicate that level of the relations, causal relations in some maybe even recurrent network, then that would be potentially more promising.
Thank you. One more question is that what do you think about the conscious prior is Benjio's?
I'm not that familiar with his idea, but his stuff, as well as some of these, theoretical approaches are probably more towards a behavioristic kind of ideas, right? Benjio doesn't seem to care about what the AI is feeling. No, am I correct?
Yeah, because actually, I suppose maybe the Benjio mentioned that he like to propose deep learning 2.0. That is some level of the consciousness. But he mentioned that actually the conscious prior is not how to say real consciousness. So we're not dealing with some real issues of the consciousness. It's just artificial system he mentioned, but I suppose some potential to explain and to the design. Of course, his group devised some engineering aspect of the design the consciousness. Some part is very sometimes too artificial, but it's some potential I feel. But anyhow, so let's discuss maybe later. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Asada, for the question, and thank you again, Professor Tsuchiya. Dr. do you have a question? Yes, please.
Thank you for the talk. Thank you for the talk. It's really great. Just on your point of to further advance AI, you mentioned the best approach is to mimic the way human brain works. If my understanding of what your point is correct, so if that's correct, would it be correct to also assume that it is necessary for AI models to continue to grow in size and complexity so that they can attempt to mimic the complexity of the human brain?
It depends on, of course, your purpose as well, right? So if you want to make AI sort of the conscious and also self kind of generated, then you would need to make it more like bigger and more complex kind of AI system as well. And one of the current, let's say, feed-forward deep learning type limitation is that it doesn't actually continuously learn things, right? You need to have a huge amount of data to learn first and then fix it. But that's very unnatural for the brain to do, right? And that kind of model wouldn't actually, for example, generate such as like an effect of the quantum cognition. All the answers are already there before you ask. And that's the kind of the limitation, I think, which may be good for the purpose of, useful AI as a tool, right? But for AI itself to have its own perspective, they wouldn't need to have that kind of reliability.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, but I guess we can take this offline. But there's a new kind of language model in NLP called the GPT family of language models, whereby train on a huge amount of data, but you don't need to train it again with a new task. What you do is you give it a natural language instruction or prompt. Then the model takes this prompt and some data, then it will be able to give you the answer. So in a sense, that's similar to what you have said. The model has already the knowledge. You just need a way to elicit the knowledge from the model.
Right. Yeah, I've been quite impressed by some of the outcomes of the GPT, but also it's quite different from how the human actually talks as well, right?
Of course.
And maybe that's related to how our conversation is always dependent on others. We can write a long sentence like GPT-3 does, but it's also quite a painful activity for us as well, right? We usually converse in short bursts of the things, and then we change our perspective depending on this conversation. And that's the kind of ability, that would probably require some kind of architecture which has this type of thing, like without question, no answers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you again, Professor Tsuchiya, for your presentation. So I think it's time for us to move on.